Hey there, Refuge Church. It's so good to be back with you. We are doing a quick little three-parter series before we go on sabbatical for the summer. And I'm excited. We're going to talk about a couple important, essential, frequently asked questions. uh, Pieces of the Refuge DNA. This is not the entirety of who we are, but it is a helpful thing. Hopefully, it'll be a good resource. We're not doing the series because we think that Refuge is the coolest in the biz and we're just trying to give a template for the rest of the world to catch up with us. We're not even trying to celebrate ourselves. We're just clarifying for ourselves and for others what we're doing. We're trying to stay on target with our values and do some learning together. So the first thing, if you show up at Refuge, and if I have remembered in in-person service to give a proper introduction rather than just blasting off into whatever I'm talking about that day, one of the first words you'll hear me say in that introduction is that we are an ecumenical church. What does that even mean? How does that help shape our mission? What is that about? What are we about? So I'm going to pray and then kick into that. Should be good. God, I thank you that there is a long history of being part of your family and a beautiful faith tradition with ups and downs that we are a part of, whether we like it or not. And so I pray that you would meet us as we do a little survey of history, of what it means to be part of this faith tradition. And I just ask that you would meet us in that spot. And that your spirit would do some work as we try to lean into this tension of what it might look like, not just to be ecumenical, but to be part of your family. So I pray that this series would bear fruit in us and that we would leave it looking more like you. I ask these things in your name, Jesus. Amen. All right. So what does ecumenical even mean? First off, comes from the Greek oikumenikos. Oikumenikos is not my translation jam. Y'all know this, but that means from the whole world. Oikumenikos means from the whole world. So here's the big idea. To say that you're ecumenical means that you don't necessarily identify with a single denomination. But rather that you're inclusive of all denominations. So it's not that we're not like any denominations, it's that we embrace the whole rich heritage of Christian faith. Ecumenical means we're about unity. So a couple quick fire questions before we really get into it. Sounds like a new progressive buzzword, Pastor Elle. No, it's actually through the whole scope of Christian history. We're going to see that together. Second question, sounds something like non-denominational to me. Great question. We're going to get into it. You said unity. Does that mean you're really Unitarians? No, Unitarians are about the unity of God. So they deny the divinity of Jesus. They're not about the Trinity. They're not about the personhood of the Spirit. We are about those things. We are talking about unity of God's people, not unity of God's self. Okay, so we are going to do a survey of some Christian history here, which I've been getting requests for, so hopefully I'm not being too self-indulgent here, but just keep in mind if church history is your jam that I'm mashing a lot of things together, so have some grace for me. We are going to try to duck some facile constructions, some common myths, and lean into the incredible richness, diversity, and complexity of the story of our faith. So first we're going to walk through what are some things that are not true, and they're going to relate to ecumenicism. So some common incorrect myths about the church history. Myth number one, the early church, everything was great. Everybody was just Team Jesus, so there was lots of unity. Myth number two, then the Catholic Church consolidated power and forced everybody to believe exactly the same thing, and so there was still unity. Myth number three, but then the Protestant Reformation happened, and we split into a bajillion different denominations, and so there was no unity anymore, and everybody just thought they were better than everybody else. Myth number four, then at some point, probably quite recently, and probably a bunch of American Protestants, because we're always the protagonists somehow, were like, these institutions were dumb. And so we struck out yelling freedom like we are auditioning for Braveheart. And now there's a bit of unity again in these ecumenical circles. So literally none of those statements are true. So let's walk through them together. We, in our idealism, which makes sense, we love to cast the early church as this idealistic arrow in which only Acts 2 is always lived out. Everyone knew it was important. We only really had house churches anyway, so institutions couldn't really ruin anything. It's helpful to have an archetype to look back toward, and to, serve as a model. And so I get what we're trying to do sometimes there, but that's not the story that we have in the epistles specifically. So the letters from the apostles to the churches testify that there was a whole bunch of division, splitting up the church and causing problems from the very beginning, right? We have this verse in 1 Corinthians that says, stop saying I follow Paul and I follow Apollos. But bigger than that, Paul, speaking of which, spends a whole bunch of his epistles going back and forth, mediating between the groups that say that the new Christians need to become Jewish and take on circumcision, right, is a big part of that conversation in order to be part of the family of God. And another group that says, no, fam, it's chill. Everything is chill, in fact. And Paul comes in and says, no, not everything's chill. Please do these things. But no, you don't need to become Jewish in order to be Christian. So that's like the whole book of Romans. That's Galatians, is trying to figure out how to balance this disunity, these differing opinions, the strife. It's also in Corinthians. So we also have evidence that the early church followed different threads of values that they felt were outlined by the different apostles. So some academics disagree, but there's evidence that there's a Johannine community of people who were really jacked up about the writings of John, and they defined those as their values. There's a whole bunch of councils and synods in this era as well, in which folks from Africa, Asia, and Europe all got together and tried to hash out new ideas and figure out what unity looked like in that era in the middle of it. So here's the complexity. It's great. There's diversity, there's some tension, there's some attempts at unity, and that's all wonderful. Because while maybe folks running around telling everybody they need to be circumcised isn't wonderful or great, having different voices who are all part of one big family, one big table, is great. We need people who are really influenced by the book of James and say, no, faith without works is dead. Belief without doing something about it is garbage. We also need to have voices at the table to say, like, no, faith alone is what makes us who we are. And we also need people who are jacked up on John and say, look, guys, it's all about love. So we need all of these different voices. Hopefully they're mature ones, but we need them at the table to keep us in balance. We need the diversity in amongst the unity. That is good, right? We talked about Tower of Babel a couple of weeks ago. All of this is kind of related to that idea about how diversity and unity can go together. Okay, so the second fallacy, marching through that list there, was that the Catholic Church, who, by the way, in our mind is all white and colonial, which wasn't true then and isn't true now, consolidated power and forced everybody to believe exactly like them. So at that time, there was unity. Incorrect. Certainly, there were efforts, as previously stated, to consolidate what the emerging faith was going to believe. However, there was still diversity of thought within that early tradition, including Catholic tradition. There's the Alexandrian school, which is helmed by folks like Origen and Clement. Both of those guys were from Egypt, by the way. And that school was more allegorical and mystical, and that was their approach to reading these different texts that make up our Bible. Versus there is the Antioch school, which favored more literal, down-to-earth interpretations. This is a guy like John Chrysostom, whose name I can never say very easily. Theodore of Mopsuestia is from Syria. John was from southern Turkey. So there are differences in our interpretation. There's difference in belief. There's also difference in practice, right? Passover is celebrated on different dates within the early Catholic Church. There are differences in practice, like some Catholic churches, despite what the Protestant Reformation propaganda passed down to us over millennia has told us, not a full millennia, 500 years, has told us, plenty of churches gave their sermons in the vernacular language, and some stuck only with Latin, right? It kind of depended on their flock and what languages they spoke. Certainly there were individuals doing their own thing. But that's the whole point, right? There was diversity of thought, of practice. It wasn't just all one behemoth thing. Another example of that, the Benedictine order formed their own sect in the 500s, guided by values of work, of prayer, of rooted communal living. And there would be many other sects that followed later. So I'm not saying that this era in our Christian history was a utopia, right? The folks like Arius were still probably exiled to Albania. But again, there's this interplay of diversity and unity the whole way through our story. So if we are out there thinking that we are the first radicals to have a divergent theological position on some random issue, that's just not the case. You might feel alone in that imagining, and you can instead know that there's a whole history of people who said, maybe not. Let's try a different way of looking at this. Let's try living this out a different way. Okay, third fallacy. Once the Protestant Reformation happened, Christianity split into 1 billion denominations and split between tiny factors that don't really matter, and everybody threw unity out the door. So Protestantism did herald a new age because they didn't have the formalized central authority of the Catholic Church. Congregations all over Europe were free to embrace different interpretations and beliefs. And our current over-cluttered denominational landscape is really a part of that legacy. That is true. And it was also true that sometimes those differences led to violence. There's a whole Wikipedia page called the European Wars of Religion, which detailed the various disputes between Catholics and Protestants, between different kinds of Protestants all over the continent for a couple different centuries, between city-states, between cantons, people groups, people within cities. And that kind of came from an attempt of different people to forge their different utopias. They were trying to say, hey, we're Geneva and we're going to do things this way. And Bern in Switzerland said, no, we want to stay Catholic. We want to do these things this way. However, pushes to unity still happened, which again can sometimes be left out of our dramatic retellings of the Protestant Reformation. So here are just a couple examples of that. There's the Marburg Colloquy, probably saying all of that wrong, but that's between Luther and Zwingli, two guys who had big differences in their ideas about communion, and they still got together and found their common ground and worked toward unity between their various groups to try to reduce war and violence and disunity. We had the Wittenberg Concord. The Wittenberg Concord was Melanchthon and some other guys. We had the Heidelberg Catechism, was written in order to try to coalesce in this early era. Hey, what is our common ground? What do we really all believe? Let's work this out. Let's find family between our different emerging groups, even as we try to do stuff a little bit differently from each other. The Synod of Dort was also originally under those auspices. People were pushing everybody to come together, or different thought leaders to come together, different theologians to come together, to try to find Christian unity in the times of enormous polarization. You want to talk about polarization? Let's look at these couple centuries in Europe, right? So this has been a movement. This has been something people have been working on and towards for a very long time. And so when we can tap into that and tap into this inclusiveness, this way of saying, hey, we might have different views on communion. For instance, like Luther and Zwingli, we can still acknowledge that we are part of one family and that we're working towards these common goals, and let's dwell in that space rather than a space of authoritarianism or a space of arrogance and pride, right? To look like Jesus means setting aside those things. The final fallacy, so close to Final Fantasy, sorry nerds, ecumenicism is probably a progressive term cooked up recently by a bunch of lefty Americans who don't actually care about truth. I'd whack my my desk here if it wouldn't shake everything. This is not true. So the term first pops up in the 16th century, not usually the century we think of. We're talking about a whole bunch of hippies. Renewed interest in ecumenicism really came up in the 1800s, though, also not incredibly recently. And the reason that it came up in that era was the world was opening up. People were doing some missionary work and some social work. For Protestants were doing it kind of for the first time. Jesuits had been doing it for ages. But anyway, so the Christian family started saying, hey, we have travel opportunities that never existed before, and we need to find folks who are willing to go do medical work, to do all sorts of work, some of which was great, some of which was not so great. We can make room for both of those things being true. And so groups like the YMCA, the Oxford Movement, the Edinburgh Missionary Conference, and many more, just pulling some here, all put in the legwork to create an inclusive unity across denominations. Because at that time, you know, India is opening up its borders and letting people come in. If you're going to be like, but what do you think about communion and this like fine theological point, you're going to have a way smaller number of volunteers than you did before, right? And so out of this joint shared vision, folks came together to try to say, hey, being a Christian means being about these things. Let's do these things together. Let's do this peace work together. Those two things did happen. It wasn't just evangelists. There's also people doing peace work. There's also people doing social work. Important to say. Okay. The Revised Standard Version and all of its updated editions came out of this era. It's created out of that desire. So if you didn't know, many Bible translations are funded by specific denominations, which they should be forced to put on their spine of the Bible. This was written by this group, but they don't. So you have to do a little Wikipedia search to find out who's funding those translations. But the RSV was written by a whole bunch of people, Catholics and Protestants from all these different denominations, trying to make an agenda-less translation of the Bible, which is very cool. So where does all of these myths, where does this big survey lead us? So ecumenicism, remember, Greek, from the whole world, has been a long-standing movement within the history of the church. We have shared purposes, we have shared aims, we are shared a family. There has always been an interplay, sometimes a tension between diversity and unity within our global faith. At Refuge, that looks a couple of different ways. It means that we don't have membership contracts where you have to sign a particular doctrinal statement. Somebody even joked about that last week. It's so not part of who we are. It means that we have the table open for a whole bunch of atonement theories, right? That series we just finished. It means that we don't say this one way of following Jesus is the way that it has to be for each and every person with these particular spiritual disciplines, right? And we truly believe that this is not wishy-washy pandering, that this is just being seeker sensitive. We don't think that we're starting a demolition of long-held truths. We don't think we're catering to the culture. These efforts have been a part of what it means to be Christian for 2,000 years. We are walking in the tradition of what Christianity has always been and has always been doing. and saying, but it has to be this way, is more of a modern line of thinking than everything else we were just talking about, right? That posture in American denominations, if you look at history, really started flexing its muscles most recently. Surprise, surprise, at the same time as like the rise of McCarthyism, right? And so when we hear that voice that says, well, it seems like you're betraying what the faith is all about, because of a different posture about X issue or Y issue, we can remember, is this the church? Is this Christianity? Or is this a particular era, a particular response that is new, that is trying to flex its power and consolidate a particular narrative for a different reason? Yes, there are other eras in church history which also subscribed to authoritarianism, right? I think about the Inquisition, I think about Tudor England, right? But I want us, this is not a whole church history series, but I want us to interrogate those, Spanish Inquisition joke, I want us to interrogate those because so often in the eras where the state and the church are like this, the state ends up using the church to accomplish its own aims, right? Henry VIII tortured plenty of people in the Tower of London for not doing what he wanted them to do theologically, but that was motivated by his desire for freedom in his marital life, right? And so he utilized the church as part of that. He convinced himself that that was okay by listening to Protestants and going through this whole thing. And that's not necessarily Christianity doing that. He demolished the holy orders in England and defunded all the monasteries, not because Christians were saying like, your sect is bad and we should all believe the same thing, and that's the history of Christianity, but because that particular man needed more money and so he plundered the monasteries. That particular person was angry at the papacy for these reasons, and so he was lashing out, right? And so we want to apply these lenses because the narrative that, well, Christianity is just this, and if therefore I don't want to be part of it because it's just always doing these bad things in the world. Okay, there's a lot of back and forth there. There are some things that are certainly uncomfortable that we need to acknowledge and wrestle with and figure out how we're going to, redeem what has been done, how we're going to be better ancestors, how we are going to try to move, use our agency, use our vote within our faith to come into better alignment with the person of Jesus, right? All of that is good work. But when we go along with these myths about what it means to be a Christian and what we've done for years, we miss out on the ability to make our vote, right? And all of this is not necessarily comfortable. That's another thing that's kind of part of the values at Refuge Church, is that ecumenicism is not always cozy. It's not always comfy. We sing lots of songs about there being room at the table, and we want to live at a place with a crowded table. But making room and being curious at first can feel really fun. Being open to reform, being open to being wrong is not always fun. Being open to folks who are different from you can be a pretty tiring affair. It can make us feel insecure on both sides of the aisle, which both sides of the theological aisle have the potentiality to be able to hurt one another, especially with our assumptions about, well, we all think blah, blah, blah. Maybe somebody doesn't think that. And so it's kind to ask and not assume. It's kind to consider others more significant than yourself, to quote Philippians. It is kind to ask people, wow, that's so different from what I think. Tell me about what's compelling about that to you, with curiosity, with love, with compassion, with openness, not just with, I'm going to wait for you to say that one verse so I can tell you what it actually means, right? That's not the posture we want to cultivate. That's not the posture that Jesus had. If there's any way for us to escape the drama triangle that the country is in about polarization, marginalization, right? We have to be able to exit that space by making room for a crowded table, for all sorts of people to be welcome, and say what is meaningful to them about their faith and stay in dialogue. Inclusion is not always easy, but it is part of who we are. Way back to the very beginning, Jesus was, forcing folks into one field, Romans and Gentiles and Jewish people, oppressors and the oppressed, all into one space to listen to him talk. And that's part of the beauty of who we are. And so we don't want to lose that. We want to make room. The kingdom of God is at hand right here in the right now, not just when that person leaves, not just when they change their minds, not just when that group repents and comes back to the truth, not just to when those people get rid of their boxes about who God is, right? Kingdom of God is at hand right now, and we want to all take part in it together. So hopefully that's helpful. That's why we're ecumenical. Hopefully there's something inspiring and hopeful and invitation in that for us. So I will pray. God, thank you that this history of your people is longer and more complex than sometimes we imagine. I thank you that there are heroes in that we can identify with, that we can call upon, that we can be inspired by, just as there's heroes in your word. I ask that we would do this work, not just being an ecumenical church in name, but that we would be ecumenical people in our hearts, that we would make space for people who are different than us, who have different values than us, different beliefs than us, different practices than us. I pray that we wouldn't put ourselves off in some upper room, in some corner in which we can feel like we're the most evolved, the most right, the most well thought out, but that we can humbly say, hey, I'm poking through this whole life experience, and I don't want to be alone. And I know I'm not any better than you, so why don't we do this together? I pray that we would have that humility, we would have that curiosity, that we would be willing to put up with the work. It is so much easier to stay in our own living rooms and not even go to a faith community, but just feed ourselves. And so I pray that you would be with us, that we would experience the greater joy of having a seat at a crowded table. So I pray all these things in your name, Jesus. Amen. Bye, guys.